Have you ever been judged so harshly by your appearance that people forgot you were even human? Have you ever walked into a room and felt every single pair of eyes cutting through you like knives, their disgust so palpable you could taste it in the air? Well, let me tell you about the day I walked into Sterling and Associates law firm, one of the most prestigious legal establishments in the entire city, wearing clothes so ragged and torn that I looked like I'd been sleeping in alleyways for months, because that's exactly what I had been doing. My shoes were held together with duct tape, my jeans had holes that weren't fashionable but rather the result of genuine wear and survival, and my shirt, well, it had once been white, but now it carried the stains of a life lived on the margins of society. I remember standing outside that gleaming glass building, its surface reflecting the perfect blue sky, looking at my distorted reflection in those pristine windows and feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest so severely I thought I might actually be sick right there on the marble steps. The building stood 40 stories high, reaching toward the heavens like a monument to success and power, everything I no longer had, everything I'd lost in what felt like a previous lifetime. I could see through those massive glass doors into the lobby, where men and women in $1,000 suits walked with purpose and confidence, their leather briefcases swinging at their sides, their phones pressed to their ears as they discussed cases worth millions, maybe billions of dollars. They belonged there. I didn't. At least that's what everyone was about to tell me with their eyes, their sneers, their barely concealed laughter. But I had no choice. I had to walk through those doors because inside that building, somewhere on one of those 40 floors, was the answer to everything. The key to understanding why my entire life had fallen apart, why my family was gone, why I'd spent the last 8 months living like an animal, scraping by day after day, night after night, wondering if I'd survive to see another sunrise. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door handle, not just from fear but from the cold that seemed to have permanently settled into my bones after countless nights sleeping under bridges, in abandoned buildings, anywhere I could find shelter from the elements. The moment I pulled that door open, the blast of air conditioning hit me like a physical force, and with it came the scent of expensive cologne, fresh flowers from the massive arrangement in the center of the lobby, and something else, something I'd almost forgotten existed, the smell of success, of money, of a world I used to belong to, but now could only observe from the outside looking in. The marble floor of the lobby was so polished I could see my reflection in it, and that reflection made me want to turn around and run back into the anonymity of the streets where at least people's disgust was honest and straightforward, not hidden behind polite masks that would slip the moment they thought I couldn't see them anymore. But I kept walking, my taped-up shoes making embarrassing squeaking sounds against that perfect marble, sounds that seemed to echo through the entire cavernous space, announcing my presence to everyone within earshot. I felt every eye turn toward me. The security guard at the front desk straightened up immediately, his hand moving subtly toward something on his belt, probably pepper spray or a radio to call for backup, as if I were a threat, a dangerous criminal who'd wandered in off the streets to rob the place or cause some kind of scene. 2 young lawyers, both women in their late 20s, wearing designer suits that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month, stopped their conversation mid-sentence and stared at me with expressions of such pure shock and revulsion that I actually felt my face burn with shame. One of them whispered something to the other, covering her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand, and they both let out these little laughs, trying to stifle them but failing miserably, their shoulders shaking with suppressed amusement at the spectacle I presented. An older gentleman in a 3-piece suit actually stepped aside as I walked past, pressing himself against the wall, as if poverty might be contagious, as if my misfortune might rub off on him through simple proximity. I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. But more than that, I wanted answers. I needed answers. Because 8 months ago, I hadn't been this person. 8 months ago, I had been someone completely different. Someone who belonged in places like this. Someone who wore those same expensive suits and carried those same leather briefcases and never once stopped to think about what it might be like to lose everything in a single devastating moment. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with steel-gray hair pulled back into a tight bun that seemed designed to match her tight expression, looked up from her computer as I approached her desk, and I watched her face transform through a fascinating sequence of emotions in the span of about 3 seconds. First, professional courtesy, the mask every receptionist wears when they see movement in their peripheral vision. Then recognition that something was very wrong with this picture, that the person approaching her desk did not belong in this environment. Then disgust, poorly concealed behind a tightening of her lips and a slight wrinkle of her nose, as if she'd suddenly detected an unpleasant odor, which, to be fair, she probably had, because hygiene becomes somewhat challenging when you're living on the streets and public restrooms are your only option for washing up. And finally, her expression settled into something like defensive hostility, her body language shifting to create a barrier between us, her hands moving to guard her keyboard as if I might try to steal something from her desk, her eyes darting toward the security guard as if silently pleading for intervention. "Can I help you?" she asked, and those 4 words contained entire volumes of subtext, none of it positive. The way she emphasized help made it clear she thought the only help I needed was directions to the nearest homeless shelter or soup kitchen, certainly not any service this prestigious law firm might provide. I opened my mouth to speak, and I realized my throat was so dry from nervousness and from the general dehydration that comes with not having regular access to clean drinking water, that my voice came out as barely more than a raspy whisper. "I need to see someone," I managed to say, and even I could hear how pathetic I sounded, how desperate and broken. "About the Harrison estate." The receptionist's expression didn't change, not even a flicker of recognition at the name that should have meant something, that should have triggered some kind of response. Instead, she sighed, a long-suffering sigh that suggested I was just another inconvenience in her day, another problem to be dealt with and dismissed as quickly as possible. "I'm sorry, but we don't handle walk-ins," she said, not sounding sorry at all, her tone making it abundantly clear that even if they did handle walk-ins, they certainly wouldn't handle my kind of walk-in. "You'll need to make an appointment through our website, and I should warn you that our attorneys are very selective about the cases they take on, and there's typically a retainer fee of—" But I interrupted her, something I never would have done in my previous life, when I still had manners and social graces and understood the unwritten rules of polite society. "It's not about a case," I said, my voice growing stronger despite my appearance, despite the shame burning through every cell of my body. "It's about an estate, the Harrison estate. And that's when I saw him, striding across the lobby with the kind of confidence that comes from years of winning, from knowing that doors open for you automatically, that the world bends to your will because you have the power and influence to make it bend. Christopher Sterling himself, the senior partner, the man whose name was literally on the building, wearing a suit that probably cost more than some people's cars, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, his shoes shined to such a brilliant gleam they could have served as mirrors. He was talking to 2 junior partners, gesturing animatedly about something, probably a case they'd just won or were about to win, and as they walked past the reception desk, his eyes flickered over me for just a fraction of a second, and I saw the exact same progression of emotions I'd seen on everyone else's face. But his final expression was different. Not hostility, not even disgust, just dismissal. Complete and utter dismissal, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been temporarily moved into the wrong room and would soon be relocated to its proper place. He didn't even break stride in his conversation, didn't acknowledge my existence beyond that momentary glance, and I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that this wasn't going to work, that whatever I'd hoped to accomplish by coming here was doomed to failure because people like me, people who looked like me, didn't get hurt in places like this. We were invisible, or worse than invisible. We were actively erased from the narrative of spaces like this because our presence disrupted the carefully constructed illusion of success and prosperity that places like Sterling and Associates worked so hard to maintain. The receptionist, emboldened by her boss's complete dismissal of my presence, leaned back in her chair with a satisfied expression. "As I was saying," she continued, her voice now dripping with condescension, "you'll need to go through proper channels and, frankly, given the nature of your—" She paused, her eyes traveling over my appearance with barely disguised contempt. "Situation. I'm not sure this is the right firm for you. Perhaps you should try Legal Aid downtown. They help people who can't afford proper representation." And there it was. The assumption that not only did I not belong here, but that I couldn't possibly afford to belong here. That my poverty was so evident, so overwhelming, that even discussing fees would be a waste of everyone's time. And the worst part was, she wasn't entirely wrong. I couldn't afford this place. I couldn't afford anywhere. I had exactly $17.38 in my pocket, Money I'd earned by helping a guy move furniture out of his apartment 3 days ago. Money I'd been planning to use to buy food that would last me through the week if I was careful and strategic about it. But what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I wasn't here as a client. I was here as something else entirely, something that would shock every single person in this building if they only knew, if they only looked beyond the surface of what they saw standing before them. Have you ever felt so frustrated, so completely powerless that you wanted to scream at the top of your lungs just to make someone, anyone, listen to you? That's exactly how I felt in that moment, standing in that pristine lobby while people walked past me like I was a ghost, like I didn't exist, like my words didn't matter because my appearance had already told them everything they needed to know about my worth as a human being. But then something happened that changed everything, something I hadn't anticipated because I'd been so focused on just getting through those front doors, just making it to someone who might listen, that I hadn't thought through what would happen next. A young paralegal, couldn't have been more than 25 years old, came rushing through the lobby carrying a massive stack of files, moving so quickly she wasn't watching where she was going, and she collided directly with me, sending papers flying everywhere, documents scattering across that perfect marble floor like leaves in an autumn wind. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, immediately dropping to her knees to gather the papers, and I instinctively knelt down to help her because that's what you do when someone drops something, regardless of what you're wearing or how you look or how society has judged you in that moment. We were both on the floor gathering papers, and she was apologizing profusely, and I was telling her it was okay, that accidents happen, trying to be kind even though my heart was pounding, because now I was even more visible, even more of a spectacle, this ragged, homeless-looking person on his hands and knees in the middle of this prestigious law firm's lobby. But as I handed her a stack of papers I'd collected, our eyes met, really met, not the dismissive glances I'd been getting from everyone else, but actual eye contact, human to human, and I saw something different in her gaze, curiosity maybe, or possibly just basic human decency that hadn't been completely trained out of her by the corporate environment. "Thank you," she said quietly, and she actually smiled, a real smile, not the fake professional smiles I'd seen on everyone else's faces before they remembered to be disgusted by my appearance. We stood up together, and as we did, one of the documents slipped from the stack she was holding and fluttered back down to the floor, landing face up right at the receptionist's feet. And that's when everything changed. Because that document, that single piece of paper that had decided to escape at precisely the right moment, or the wrong moment, depending on how you looked at it, had a name on it. Not just any name. My name. My real name. The name I'd been trying to tell the receptionist but hadn't been able to finish. The name that appeared on that document in bold, official letters at the top of what was clearly a legal brief or estate document. Harrison. But not just Harrison. The full name. Alexander James Harrison III. The paralegal saw it at the same moment the receptionist did, and I watched both their faces transform as they processed what they were seeing, as the implications began to dawn on them. The receptionist's hand actually flew to her mouth, her eyes going wide with shock and something that looked a lot like fear, because she was suddenly realizing, suddenly understanding that she'd just dismissed and insulted someone she absolutely should not have dismissed or insulted. Someone whose name carried weight in this building. Someone whose family's estate was probably worth more than she'd make in her entire lifetime. The paralegal looked from the document to me and back again, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. She started, but I cut her off, finally finding my voice, finally feeling like maybe, just maybe, someone would actually listen to me now. "I'm Alexander Harrison," I said, and my voice was steady now, stronger than it had been since I walked through those doors, because saying my name out loud, claiming that identity after 8 months of being nobody, of being invisible, of being dismissed and forgotten, felt like putting on armor, like stepping back into a version of myself I'd thought was lost forever. I'm the grandson of Alexander Harrison Sr. and the son of Alexander Harrison Jr. My family established the trust that this firm has been managing for the past 40 years. I'm here because I've been trying to reach someone, anyone, in this office for 3 months, and every single call I've made has been ignored. Every message I've left has gone unanswered, and I finally realized that the only way I was going to get anyone's attention was to show up in person, regardless of what I looked like, regardless of how I'd be received. The lobby had gone silent. Not completely silent because life in a busy law firm never truly stops. But the immediate area around us had definitely quieted, conversations trailing off as people realized something significant was happening, something that disrupted the normal flow of their day. The receptionist had gone pale, all the blood draining from her face as she undoubtedly ran through every dismissive word she'd said to me in the last 5 minutes, calculating how much trouble she was in, how badly she'd messed up by not listening, by not giving me the benefit of the doubt, by judging me solely on my appearance instead of treating me with basic professional courtesy. Christopher Sterling, who had been halfway across the lobby by this point, had stopped walking. I could see him in my peripheral vision, standing completely still, his conversation with the junior partners forgotten, his attention now fully focused on the scene unfolding at the reception desk. And then he was walking back toward us, his stride purposeful now, his expression no longer dismissive but intensely focused, calculating, the wheels clearly turning behind those sharp eyes as he assessed the situation, as he recognized the potential disaster his firm was facing. "Mr. Harrison?" he said as he approached, and the way he said it, the careful neutrality in his tone, told me he was still skeptical, still not entirely convinced that the ragged person standing in his lobby could possibly be who he claimed to be, but also not willing to risk the consequences of being wrong about something this significant. "I apologize if there's been any confusion. Perhaps we should discuss this in private?" It wasn't really a question. It was a command disguised as a suggestion, a way of removing me from the public space where other clients and employees could witness whatever was about to unfold, a way of containing potential damage to the firm's reputation. But I'd come too far, endured too much to let him control the narrative now. "There's been no confusion," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded, how controlled, when inside I was a churning mass of anger and hurt and bitter satisfaction at finally being taken seriously, even if it was only because they'd seen my name on a document. "I've been trying to contact this firm for months about my family's estate, about the trust fund that should have been released to me when I turned 25, which happened 6 months ago. I've left messages, sent emails, even tried to make appointments through your website, but somehow none of my attempts to reach anyone ever resulted in a response, and I think I know why." The way Christopher Sterling's jaw tightened told me I'd hit a nerve, that my suspicions weren't just paranoia born from months of living on the streets, weren't just the desperate theories of someone who'd lost everything and needed someone to blame. There was something here, something wrong, something that explained why the grandson of one of the firm's most important clients had been systematically ignored and shut out from accessing information about his own inheritance. "Mr. Harrison, I assure you that if there's been any miscommunication, it was entirely unintentional," Sterling said, and his voice had taken on that smooth, lawyer quality, the tone that could make anything sound reasonable and benign even when it absolutely wasn't. "The Harrison estate is one of our most important accounts, and I personally oversee all matters related to it. If you'll come with me to my office, I'm certain we can clear up any misunderstandings and address your concerns." But I wasn't done. Not yet. Because I'd spent 8 months wondering why my life had fallen apart so completely, why everything had been taken from me, why I'd been left with nothing while somewhere, supposedly, there was a trust fund with my name on it, money that should have been mine, resources that could have prevented every single horrific night I'd spent on the streets, every meal I'd skipped, every moment of fear and desperation and bone-deep exhaustion. "Before we go anywhere," I said, my voice rising slightly because I could feel all that pent-up frustration and anger starting to bubble over, "I want to know why my uncle has been receiving distributions from the Harrison Family Trust for the past 6 months while I, the primary beneficiary according to my grandfather's will, haven't received a single cent. I want to know why Richard Harrison has been signing documents on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. And I want to know why this firm, which is supposed to be managing my family's assets in accordance with my grandfather's wishes, has allowed this to happen." The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Christopher Sterling's face went through several rapid changes of expression, settling finally on something between shock and very carefully controlled panic. The junior partners who'd been standing nearby and had definitely been listening to every word of this exchange, both took subtle steps backward, as if trying to distance themselves from what was clearly about to become a major legal and ethical shitstorm. The paralegal who'd dropped her files was staring at me with wide eyes, and I could practically see her mentally reviewing everything she knew about the Harrison account, putting pieces together, realizing that she'd just witnessed the beginning of what would probably be one of the biggest cases to hit this firm in years. "I think," Sterling said very carefully, his lawyer brain working overtime to figure out how to contain this situation, "that we definitely need to discuss this in private. There are confidentiality issues at play, matters that shouldn't be discussed in a public space. Please follow me." And this time there was an edge of desperation in his voice that told me I'd rattled him, that I'd said something that confirmed his worst fears about what I might know, what I might have discovered during my months of desperate research in public libraries, using free Wi-Fi at coffee shops during the brief windows when I could spare a couple dollars for a cup of coffee, just to sit somewhere warm and dry for an hour or two, while I dug through public records and tried to piece together what had happened to my family, to my inheritance, to my entire life. I'd been living on the streets for 8 months, but I hadn't spent all that time just surviving, just scraping by from one day to the next without any plan or purpose. Every spare moment I had, every opportunity I found, I'd been investigating, researching, trying to understand the sequence of events that had led to my complete financial ruin despite coming from one of the wealthiest families in the state. And what I discovered had been so shocking, so unbelievable, that for a long time I'd convinced myself I must be wrong, that grief and trauma and possibly malnutrition were making me see conspiracies where none existed. But the more I dug, the more evidence I found, the clearer the picture became. My grandfather, Alexander Harrison Sr., had been a brilliant businessman, a self-made millionaire who'd built his fortune through real estate investments and had been savvy enough to protect that fortune through carefully constructed trusts and legal frameworks designed to ensure his descendants would be taken care of for generations. He'd been specific in his will about how the money should be distributed, about who should receive what and when, and he'd chosen Sterling and Associates to manage the estate because he'd trusted Christopher Sterling personally, had considered him a friend as well as a lawyer. But my grandfather had died 12 years ago, when I was only 16 years old, and a lot can change in 12 years. People change, circumstances change, and sometimes, when enough money is at stake, loyalty changes too. My father, Alexander Harrison Jr., had been the sole trustee of the family estate after my grandfather's death, which meant he controlled all the assets, made all the decisions about distributions and investments, with Sterling and Associates providing legal oversight to ensure everything remained in compliance with the trust documents. But my father had died 2 years ago when I was 23, in what was officially ruled a car accident but which had always felt wrong to me, suspicious in ways I couldn't quite articulate but couldn't ignore either. The night he died, he'd called me, late at night, and his voice had been strange, agitated in a way I'd never heard from him before. He'd said he needed to talk to me about something important, something about the family trust, something about irregularities he'd discovered in the accounting, but he'd never made it to that meeting. His car had gone off a bridge on a rainy night, and by the time emergency services arrived, it was too late. The official investigation concluded that he'd been driving too fast for conditions, had lost control on a wet road, and the case was closed within a few weeks. I'd been devastated, obviously. My mother had died when I was young, so my father had been my only family, the only person in the world I could count on, and suddenly he was gone, and I was alone. But I was also 23 years old, still in graduate school and supposedly the heir to a substantial fortune that would be held in trust until I turned 25, at which point I'd gain full access to the assets my grandfather had accumulated and my father had carefully managed. My uncle Richard, my father's younger brother, had stepped in as the temporary trustee, which made sense at the time because the trust documents required an adult family member to serve in that role until I came of age, and Richard was the only other Harrison left besides me. Richard had always been the family disappointment, the younger brother who'd never quite measured up to my father's success, who'd gone through multiple failed business ventures and marriages, who'd always seemed to have his hand out asking for money. But my grandfather had loved him despite his flaws, had made provisions for him in the trust, ensuring he'd receive a modest annual distribution to help support himself. And my father, despite their differences, had honored those provisions, had made sure Richard was taken care of even when he probably didn't deserve it. I hadn't particularly liked my Uncle Richard, if I'm being honest. He'd always made me uncomfortable with his too loud laugh and his tendency to make inappropriate jokes at family gatherings, his habit of drinking too much and saying things that made everyone else awkward. but I'd never imagined he was capable of what I eventually discovered he'd done. For the first year after my father's death, everything seemed fine. I was grieving, trying to finish my degree, trying to process the enormous loss of my only remaining parent, and I wasn't paying much attention to financial matters because I assumed the trust was being managed properly, that everything would be waiting for me when I turned 25. Richard would call occasionally, ask how I was doing, tell me not to worry about anything, that he was handling all the estate business and everything was under control. I'd believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was family. He was my father's brother. And I was so consumed by grief and trying to hold my life together that I didn't think to question whether he was telling me the truth. But then strange things started happening. Small things at first. Credit cards that stopped working suddenly. My bank account, which should have had plenty of money in it from the modest monthly stipend the trust provided for my education and living expenses, was suddenly empty. When I called the bank, they told me the account had been closed by the trustee. When I tried to reach Richard to ask what was going on, he didn't answer his phone. When I tried to contact Sterling and Associates to find out what was happening with the trust, I got transferred around to different people, left messages that were never returned, and eventually stopped being able to get anyone on the phone at all. Within a few months, I'd lost my apartment because I couldn't pay rent. I'd had to drop out of graduate school because I couldn't afford tuition. I'd tried to get a job, but without a permanent address, without references, without the stability that comes from knowing where you'll sleep at night and whether you'll eat that day, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the kind of appearance and reliability employers expect. And slowly, gradually, inexorably, I'd slipped further and further down until I found myself living on the streets, sleeping in shelters when I could get a bed, sleeping under bridges when I couldn't, trying desperately to figure out what had happened to the life I was supposed to have, to the inheritance that should have been mine. I'd finally managed to access public records at the county courthouse. Had spent weeks going through documents during the few hours each day when the building was open to the public, and I could slip in without being too obvious about my homeless status. And that's when I'd found it, the evidence I needed, proof that Richard had been systematically draining the trust, taking distributions far in excess of what the trust documents allowed, signing my name to documents authorizing transfers and sales of assets, claiming to act on my behalf as a beneficiary who was mentally incapacitated and unable to manage his own affairs. He'd had a doctor sign papers claiming I was suffering from severe mental illness, that I was a danger to myself, that I needed a conservator to manage my finances because I was incapable of doing so myself. All lies, all fabricated, but apparently convincing enough that Sterling and Associates had accepted these documents and had allowed Richard to take control of the entire estate, not just as a temporary trustee, but as the person making all the decisions, moving money around, selling off properties and pocketing the proceeds. And the most damning thing I discovered was that Christopher Sterling himself had signed off on many of these transactions, had witnessed documents, had provided legal opinions supporting Richard's actions, which meant either Sterling was complicit in the fraud, actively helping my uncle steal my inheritance, or he'd been criminally negligent in his oversight of the trust, failing to verify the legitimacy of the documents Richard was presenting, failing to question why the heir to a multi-million-dollar estate had suddenly become so mentally ill that he needed a conservator, failing to do basic due diligence that any competent attorney should have done. Either way, the firm was liable. Either way, people were going to face serious consequences when this all came to light. And now here I was, standing in the lobby of Sterling and Associates, finally face to face with the man who'd allowed this to happen, who'd let my uncle steal everything while I slowly starved on the streets, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, could see him trying to figure out exactly how much I knew, how much evidence I had, how big of a problem I was going to be. "After you," I said, gesturing toward the elevators, and I was pleased to hear that my voice sounded calm, controlled, not revealing the absolute tornado of emotions swirling through me. The rage and hurt and bitter satisfaction all mixing together into something so intense I felt like I might vibrate apart at the seams. Sterling nodded and led the way toward the elevator bank, and I followed, very aware of all the eyes tracking our movement across the lobby, aware of the whispered conversations starting up in our wake as people tried to figure out what they'd just witnessed, who I was, why the senior partner himself was personally escorting someone who looked like a homeless person up to his office. The paralegal who'd dropped her files was still standing there, clutching her documents, watching us with an expression that suggested she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. The receptionist had shrunk down in her chair, probably hoping she'd be forgotten in all of this, probably praying that her earlier behavior wouldn't be mentioned to anyone important. The elevator doors opened, and Sterling gestured for me to enter first, which I did, stepping into the mirrored space and immediately confronting my own reflection from multiple angles, seeing exactly what everyone else saw when they looked at me, understanding why they dismissed me so easily. I looked terrible, worse than terrible. My hair was too long, unwashed, hanging in greasy strands around my face. My skin was pale and drawn, with dark circles under my eyes from months of insufficient sleep and chronic stress. My clothes, which I'd already cataloged in my mind, looked even worse under the bright elevator lights. I looked sick. I looked broken. I looked exactly like what I'd become, which was a person the world had chewed up and spit out, someone who'd fallen through all the cracks in the safety net that was supposed to catch people like me, though in my case, that safety net had been deliberately cut, methodically destroyed by someone who was supposed to protect me. Sterling entered the elevator behind me, followed by one of the junior partners who'd been with him earlier, and the doors closed, sealing us into this small, mirrored space together. The silence was excruciating. I could see Sterling's reflection in the mirror, could see him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, could see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he tried to formulate his strategy for dealing with this situation. The elevator rose smoothly, climbing toward the top floors where the senior partners had their offices, and with each passing floor, I felt my heart rate increase, felt the reality of what I was about to do settling over me like a heavy weight. Because this wasn't just about getting my money back, though that was certainly part of it. This was about justice. This was about holding people accountable for what they'd done. This was about making sure that my father's death hadn't been in vain, that the suspicions I'd harbored about his accident would finally be investigated properly. And yes, this was also about revenge, about making the people who'd laughed at me in that lobby, who'd dismissed me and looked at me with disgust, understand exactly who I was and what they'd done by judging me so harshly, based on nothing but my appearance. The elevator dinged softly as we reached the 40th floor, and the doors opened onto a space that was somehow even more luxurious than the lobby below. Thick carpet, original artwork on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows offering breathtaking views of the city. That same city where I'd been sleeping on the streets while Richard lived in my grandfather's mansion. While Sterling collected fees from managing an estate he wasn't actually managing properly. "This way, Mr. Harrison," Sterling said, his voice carefully neutral, and he led me down a hallway lined with photographs of the firm's partners through the years, including several of my grandfather standing alongside a much younger Christopher Sterling, both of them smiling, both of them looking like the best of friends, like men who trusted each other implicitly. I wondered what my grandfather would think if he could see what had become of that trust, what had happened to the estate he'd worked so hard to build and protect. We reached a large corner office, Sterling's name on a brass plate beside the door, and he ushered me inside, into a space that was larger than some apartments I'd lived in, with massive windows on 2 walls, a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, and shelves lined with leather-bound legal volumes that probably hadn't been opened in years because everything was digital now, but they looked impressive, which was the point. "Please sit down," Sterling said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs arranged in front of his desk, and I sat, feeling the softness of the leather beneath me, so different from the hard concrete and rough cardboard I'd been sleeping on for months. Sterling moved behind his desk but didn't sit immediately, instead standing by the window, looking out at the city, his back to me, and I realized he was trying to gather himself, trying to figure out his approach. Finally, he turned back to face me, and his expression had transformed into something that looked like concern, like compassion, though I didn't believe it for a second. "Alexander," he said, using my first name now, trying to create intimacy, trying to establish a personal connection that would make this all seem like a misunderstanding between friends rather than what it actually was, which was a massive betrayal of fiduciary duty. "I'm truly sorry about your current circumstances. I had no idea things had gotten so difficult for you. If I'd known, I would have intervened immediately." "Really?" I said, and I couldn't keep the skepticism out of my voice. "You had no idea? Despite the fact that I've been trying to contact this firm for 3 months? Despite the multiple messages I left specifically saying I was homeless and needed help accessing my trust fund? Sterling's expression flickered just for a moment, telling me he'd known, or at least someone in his firm had known, and the messages had been deliberately ignored. There may have been some communication breakdowns, he admitted carefully. Our intake procedures— Let's skip the bullshit, I interrupted, and my voice was hard now, all the anger I'd been suppressing finally bubbling up to the surface. I know what Richard has been doing. I know about the unauthorized distributions. I know about the fake medical documents claiming I'm mentally incompetent. I know about the properties that have been sold without my knowledge or consent. I know about the doctor who signed those evaluation papers despite never having met me. And I know that you signed off on all of it, that you witnessed documents and provided legal opinions supporting Richard's authority to do all of these things. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Sterling's face had gone pale, and I watched him process what I'd just said, watched him realize that this wasn't going to be a situation he could smooth over with lawyer talk and vague promises to look into things. This was real. This was documented. This was a disaster for him and his firm. How did you— he started, then stopped, realizing that how I'd found out was less important than what I'd found out. I had a lot of time, I said bitterly. When you're homeless, you've got nothing but time. Time to sit in public libraries going through records. Time to file Freedom of Information requests for every document related to the Harrison estate. Time to track down every transaction, every transfer, every single decision made with my family's money over the past 2 years. And you know what I found? I found that my uncle has stolen nearly $6 million from the trust. I found that he's been living in my grandfather's house, driving my father's cars, wearing my father's watches, living the life that should have been mine while I slept in alleys and wondered if I'd survive the winter. My hands were shaking now, not from cold or fear, but from pure rage, from the injustice of it all, from the months of suffering that could have been prevented if anyone, literally anyone at this firm, had bothered to do their job properly. Sterling moved to his desk and sat down heavily as if his legs could no longer support him, and I could see him aging before my eyes, could see the weight of what he'd done, or failed to do, settling onto his shoulders. Alexander, I don't know what to say, he began, but I cut him off again because I wasn't interested in his apologies or excuses. I'll tell you what you're going to say, I said, leaning forward in my chair, fixing him with a stare that I hoped conveyed even a fraction of what I was feeling. You're going to say that you'll immediately open an investigation into every transaction Richard has made. You're going to say that you'll freeze all his access to the trust accounts. You're going to say that you'll provide me with full accounting of every asset in the estate and every distribution that's been made since my father died. And you're going to say that you'll personally fund whatever legal action I need to take to recover everything that was stolen from me. Because if you don't, I'm going to file bar complaints, civil suits, and criminal complaints against you, Richard, and everyone else involved in this fraud. Sterling's mouth opened and closed several times, and I could see him processing, calculating, trying to figure out what his exposure was, what the firm's liability might be, what defending against my accusations would cost, versus just settling with me and hoping I'd go away quietly. I'll need to consult with my partners, he said finally, his voice hoarse. This is a serious accusation, and we'll need to review. No, I said flatly. You don't get to review anything, you don't get to consult with anyone. You don't get to buy time to figure out how to cover your ass. You make the decision right now, in this room, or I walk out of here and go directly to the district attorney's office and the State Bar Association. What's it going to be? Have you ever backed someone into a corner so completely that you could see them mentally cycling through all their options and watching each one crumble away until they had only one choice left? That's what I was watching happen with Christopher Sterling. And despite everything he'd done or failed to do, despite the months of suffering I'd endured, I felt a small twinge of something that might have been pity for him, because I could see that he hadn't meant for things to go this far, hadn't intended for me to end up on the streets, had probably convinced himself that Richard's story about my mental illness was true, and that he was doing the right thing by supporting the conservatorship. But intention doesn't matter when someone's life has been destroyed. Good intentions don't keep you warm at night when you're sleeping under a bridge. Noble motivations don't fill your stomach when you haven't eaten in 3 days. Results matter. Consequences matter. And the consequences of Sterling's negligence had nearly killed me. All right, he said finally, and his voice was defeated, exhausted, the voice of someone who just lost a battle he didn't even know he was fighting. I'll do everything you asked. We'll open a full investigation immediately, freeze Richard's access to the accounts, provide you with complete financial records, and yes, the firm will cover the costs of whatever legal action is necessary to recover the stolen assets. I felt something release inside my chest, some tension I'd been carrying for so long it had become part of me, and suddenly I could breathe more deeply than I had in months. Good, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying not to let him see how much this moment meant to me, how close I'd come to giving up entirely, to believing that justice was impossible, that the world would always favor people like Richard, who had money and connections, over people like me who had nothing but the truth. I'll also need an immediate advance against the trust, I continued, because relief didn't change the fact that I was still homeless, still had only $17 in my pocket, still needed to survive while all of this got sorted out. Enough to cover housing, clothing, food, medical expenses. I'll need it within 24 hours. Sterling nodded, pulling out a legal pad and making notes with a pen that probably cost more than I'd spent on meals in the past month. Of course. We'll arrange an emergency distribution. Is there anything else? I thought about that question, about what else I needed, and realized that what I needed more than anything was answers. I want to know if my father's death was really an accident, I said quietly, and Sterling's head snapped up, his expression startled. I want to know if Richard had anything to do with it. Because the timing was awfully convenient, wasn't it? My father dies suddenly, unexpectedly, right after he calls me to tell me he's discovered irregularities in the trust accounting, and then Richard steps in as trustee and immediately starts looting the estate. That's a hell of a coincidence. Sterling's face had gone even paler, if that was possible, and I could see that he'd never considered this angle, never thought about whether there might be a connection between my father's death and the subsequent theft of the estate assets. That's a very serious allegation, he said carefully. If you have any evidence. I don't have evidence yet, I admitted, but I think we need to look into it. I think we need to hire investigators to review the accident report, to look into Richard's activities in the weeks before and after my father died, to see if there's any connection, and if there is, if there's even the slightest possibility that Richard killed my father to get control of the trust, then I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication, with the possibility that this situation was even darker and more terrible than a simple case of financial fraud. Sterling set down his pen and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion and overwhelm. I'll make some calls, he said finally. I know some retired police detectives who do private investigation work. We'll have them look into everything. Quietly, at first, until we know if there's actually something there. Is that acceptable? I nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted myself, as if all the adrenaline that had been keeping me upright and functional had suddenly drained away, leaving me hollow and shaky. When can I expect to hear from you about the emergency advance? I asked, because I needed to know when I could stop worrying about where I'd sleep that night, when I could eat a real meal instead of whatever I could afford from a dollar menu or find in a dumpster behind a restaurant. I'll have my assistant set everything up immediately, Sterling said, standing up and moving to his door, opening it and calling out to someone in the hallway. A moment later, a different woman appeared, not the receptionist from downstairs, but someone who carried herself with more authority, probably a senior assistant or office manager. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to arrange an emergency advance from the Harrison Trust immediately. $10,000 to start, available to Mr. Harrison within the next hour. Use the firm's discretionary fund if necessary, and we'll sort out the accounting later. Also, please book a room at the Riverside Hotel for Mr. Harrison, one of their executive suites, for at least 2 weeks, and arrange for a clothing allowance at whatever stores he chooses. The firm will cover all expenses directly. Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened slightly as she took in my appearance, clearly trying to reconcile the ragged person sitting in her boss's office with the instructions she'd just received to spend tens of thousands of dollars on my immediate needs. But to her credit, she simply nodded and said, "Of course, Mr. Sterling, I'll take care of everything right away." She turned to me with a professional smile. "Mr. Harrison, if you'll come with me, we'll get you set up with everything you need." I stood up, my legs feeling unsteady, like they weren't quite sure they were supposed to be supporting me anymore. Like my body was starting to realize that the constant state of emergency I'd been living in for 8 months might actually be coming to an end. "Thank you," I said to Sterling, and I wasn't sure if I meant thank you for finally doing the right thing, or thank you for getting caught, or thank you for giving me the opportunity to reclaim my life. Maybe it was all of those things. Sterling nodded, his expression still shell-shocked, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened in his office. I truly am sorry, Alexander, he said, and this time, I thought he might actually mean it. Your grandfather trusted me to protect his family's legacy, and I failed him. I failed you. I'll do everything in my power to make this right. I didn't respond to that, just turned and followed Mrs. Patterson out of the office because words of apology didn't mean much when measured against months of suffering, and I'd heard enough empty promises to last me a lifetime. What mattered now was action, was following through, was making sure that this time, finally, things would actually change. Mrs. Patterson led me to a different elevator, one that apparently went to a different set of floors, and as we descended, she made small talk about the hotel arrangements, about how the Riverside was very comfortable and had an excellent restaurant, about how she'd arranged for someone to bring me a selection of clothes to choose from since going shopping in my current state might be uncomfortable. She was being kind, diplomatic, not mentioning the obvious fact that I couldn't walk into a high-end clothing store looking the way I currently looked without causing a scene, without facing the same judgment and dismissal I'd experienced downstairs in the lobby. The elevator opened onto a different floor, some kind of administrative level, and she led me to her office, sat me down in a comfortable chair, and began making phone calls, arranging everything with an efficiency that was impressive to watch. Within 20 minutes, she had a hotel room booked, had arranged for a car service to take me there, had contacted several clothing stores and arranged for them to send representatives to the hotel with selections in my size, had even called the hotel spa and arranged for them to provide whatever grooming services I might need. And through it all, she treated me with perfect professional courtesy, never once acting like there was anything unusual about the situation, never once looking at me with the disgust or pity I'd grown so accustomed to seeing in people's eyes. The car will be here in about 10 minutes, she said, hanging up her phone after the latest call. In the meantime, here's a company credit card for immediate expenses, and I've arranged for $10,000 to be transferred to a new bank account we've opened for you. The account information is in this envelope, along with the temporary debit card that's already activated and ready to use. Is there anything else you need right away? I looked at the envelope she was holding out to me, at the credit card lying on her desk, and I felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost overwhelmed me. These weren't just pieces of plastic and paper. They represented security, stability, the ability to meet my basic needs without fear or struggle. They represented the beginning of the end of the nightmare I'd been living. No, I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion I was trying to suppress. This is perfect. Thank you. She smiled at me, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and handed me the envelope and card. You're very welcome, Mr. Harrison. And if I may say so, I'm glad you came in today. I'm glad you persisted even when people tried to turn you away. That took courage. I didn't trust myself to speak, just nodded and clutched the envelope like it was a lifeline, which in many ways it was. The 10 minutes until the car arrived passed in a blur, and then I was being escorted downstairs through a back entrance, avoiding the main lobby where I'd made such a scene earlier, and into a sleek black car with leather seats and air conditioning that actually worked. The driver was professional and polite, asked me if I needed to stop anywhere on the way to the hotel, and when I said no, just nodded and pulled smoothly into traffic. I spent the drive staring out the window at the city I'd been navigating on foot for months, seeing it from this new perspective of comfort and safety, marveling at how different everything looked when you weren't constantly worried about where you'd sleep that night or when you'd eat next. The hotel was exactly as upscale as I'd expected, all marble and brass and uniformed staff, and when the driver pulled up to the entrance, a doorman immediately came forward to open my door. I saw his eyes flicker over my appearance, saw him processing what he was seeing, but his professional training kicked in and he simply said, "Welcome to the Riverside, sir. Let me show you to the front desk." The check-in process was smooth, facilitated by whatever Mrs. Patterson had arranged in advance, and within minutes I was being escorted to an elevator by a manager, who assured me that everything had been prepared for my arrival, and that I should please not hesitate to call, if there was anything at all, that I needed. The suite was on the 20th floor with windows overlooking the river and enough space that I could have fit my entire last apartment inside it twice. There was a bedroom with a bed that looked like it was made of clouds, a bathroom with both a shower and a separate bathtub, a living area with a couch and television and a desk, and a small kitchenette. It was more luxury than I'd experienced in years, certainly more than I'd had access to since before my father died, and I stood in the middle of it all feeling completely overwhelmed, like I'd been transported to a different universe, like the past 8 months had been a nightmare I'd finally woken up from. The first thing I did was take a shower, the longest, hottest shower of my entire life, standing under the spray until the water heater probably thought I'd died in there, washing away not just the physical dirt of months on the streets, but something deeper, something that had gotten into my pores and my soul, the accumulated degradation of being dismissed and ignored and treated as less than human. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a hotel bathrobe that was softer than anything I'd worn in recent memory, I found that room service had delivered food without my ordering it, an enormous spread of sandwiches and salads and fruit and desserts, along with a note that said compliments of Mrs. Patterson who thought you might be hungry. I was hungry. I was so hungry that the sight of all that food almost made me cry, but I forced myself to eat slowly, carefully because my stomach had shrunk over the months of insufficient food and I didn't want to make myself sick by eating too much too fast. Even so, the taste of fresh bread, of vegetables that weren't wilted, of meat that wasn't mystery meat from a dollar menu, was almost overwhelming in its simple perfection. While I was eating, there was a knock at the door, and when I answered it, I found 2 people from different clothing stores, both carrying racks of clothes in my size, everything from casual wear to business suits to shoes and accessories. They were polite, professional, acted like there was nothing unusual about bringing clothes to a hotel room for someone to try on, and spent the next hour helping me select a wardrobe that would take me from immediate needs to longer-term professional requirements. I picked out several outfits, trying on clothes that actually fit properly, that weren't torn or stained or held together with tape and prayer, and each item I added to the keep pile felt like another piece of my old identity being restored, another layer of the person I'd been forced to become being shed away. By the time they left, I had enough clothes to last me several weeks, all of it being sent up to my room within the hour, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my food and my absurdly comfortable hotel room. I should have felt happy, relieved, grateful, and I did feel all of those things, but underneath it all was a current of anger that wouldn't go away, a burning rage at Richard for what he'd done, at Sterling for letting it happen, at all the people who'd looked at me with disgust in that lobby without knowing my story, without caring to know, at a system that could let someone fall so far so fast with so few safety nets to catch them. I spent the rest of that day and evening alternating between sleeping in that incredible bed and waking up, convinced it had all been a dream, that I'd opened my eyes to find myself back under a bridge somewhere, that the past few hours had been some kind of hallucination brought on by hunger and exhaustion, but each time I woke up the room was still there. The soft sheets were still real. The sound of the river outside my window was still flowing past, and gradually, slowly, I began to accept that this was actually happening, that my life was actually changing, that I'd done it, I'd survived, I'd made it through to the other side. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Sterling's firm opened a formal investigation into Richard's handling of the trust, brought in forensic accountants to trace every transaction, hired the private investigators to look into my father's death. I met with lawyers, gave statements, signed documents, participated in depositions where I recounted everything I'd experienced, everything I'd discovered, and with each meeting, with each piece of evidence that emerged confirming what I'd suspected, I felt my case growing stronger, felt the walls closing in around Richard and everyone who'd enabled him. The investigators found that Richard had forged my signature on dozens of documents, had paid a doctor who'd lost his medical license in another state to sign the mental competency evaluation without ever meeting me, had created an entire paper trail of fake medical records and psychiatric reports to support his claim that I needed a conservator. They found transfers of money from the trust to offshore accounts, sales of properties at below-market values to companies Richard secretly owned, a systematic looting of assets that had been going on since the day my father died. And most damning of all, they found evidence that Richard had been researching methods of causing car accidents in the weeks before my father's death, had been asking questions about brake lines and mechanical failures, had been seen in the parking garage where my father kept his car multiple times in the days leading up to the crash. It wasn't enough for a murder conviction, not yet, but it was enough to reopen the investigation into my father's death, enough to get the police interested, enough to make Richard's life very, very difficult. The day Richard was arrested was one of the most satisfying days of my life, not because I took pleasure in seeing anyone suffer, but because it represented justice finally being served, accountability finally being enforced. I wasn't there when they took him into custody, but I saw the news coverage, saw him being led out of my grandfather's house in handcuffs, saw the shock and anger on his face as reporters shouted questions about the stolen millions, about the forged documents, about his brother's death. Sterling's firm moved quickly to recover as many assets as possible, filing lawsuits to void the fraudulent sales, working with prosecutors to freeze Richard's accounts and seize anything that could be traced back to the stolen trust funds. The process was complicated, would take years to fully resolve, but I was young, I had time, and more importantly, I had resources again. I had the ability to wait it out, to fight the long fight, to see it through to the end. Within a few months, I'd moved out of the hotel and into an apartment. Nothing as grand as my grandfather's mansion, but comfortable, safe, a place I could call home. I'd started therapy to process everything I'd been through, to work through the trauma of losing my father, of being betrayed by family, of spending months on the streets wondering if I'd survive. I'd begun reaching out to old friends I'd lost touch with when I'd become homeless, trying to rebuild the social connections that had been severed, finding that some people welcomed me back with open arms, while others had moved on with their lives and weren't interested in reconnecting. I'd started volunteering at a homeless shelter, using my experience to help others who were going through what I'd endured, working to change policies and systems that had failed me and continued to fail thousands of others every single day. And I'd started thinking about what I wanted to do with my life now that I had it back, what kind of person I wanted to be, what lessons I'd learned from living on both sides of the economic divide. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I couldn't look at a homeless person anymore without seeing a full human being with a story, with circumstances that had led them to that point, with dignity that deserved to be recognized regardless of their appearance or situation. I couldn't walk past someone begging on the street without stopping to talk to them, to acknowledge their existence, to give them whatever I could spare. I'd become acutely aware of how fragile the line was between success and failure, between comfort and desperation, between being seen as a valuable member of society and being dismissed as worthless. I'd learned that the social safety nets everyone talked about had enormous holes in them, that it was remarkably easy to fall through those holes, and that once you did, climbing back out was nearly impossible without help, without someone willing to look past appearances and see the person underneath. I'd learned that bureaucracy and institutional indifference could be as deadly as active malice, that the system grinding along without anyone paying attention could destroy lives just as effectively as deliberate cruelty. And I'd learned something else, something that had surprised me. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, that I could survive things I never thought possible, that I had reserves of determination and resilience I hadn't known existed until I was forced to draw on them. The boy who'd walked into that law firm 8 months after losing, everything was different from the person who'd walked out with his life beginning to be restored. I was harder in some ways, less willing to trust, more cynical about human nature and institutional systems. But I was also softer in other ways, more compassionate, more aware of suffering, more committed to using whatever privilege and resources I had to help others who were struggling. The legal proceedings against Richard stretched on for over a year, a complex web of criminal charges and civil suits that kept teams of lawyers busy and generated thousands of pages of documents and testimony. In the end, he was convicted on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, and the investigation into my father's death produced enough evidence for the district attorney to file charges of second-degree murder. The trial for that was even longer, more complex, turning on forensic evidence about the car accident, on Richard's financial motive, on the timing of everything. I sat through every day of that trial, listening to witnesses describe how the brake lines on my father's car had shown signs of tampering, how Richard had been seen in the parking garage, how he'd stood to gain everything by his brother's death. The defense argued that it was all circumstantial, that there was reasonable doubt, that the evidence could be interpreted different ways, but the jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they came back with a guilty verdict, and I watched Richard's face crumble as the judge sentenced him to 25 years to life in prison. It should have felt like victory, like justice had finally been served, and in some ways it did, but mostly I just felt tired, and sad, and empty, because no amount of prison time would bring my father back. No amount of money recovered would give me back those 8 months on the streets. No verdict would undo the trauma and suffering and fear I'd endured. Justice had been done, but it was cold comfort when measured against everything I'd lost. The money came back gradually, piece by piece, as assets were recovered and frozen accounts were released and legal proceedings concluded. I ended up with significantly less than I should have inherited, because some of what Richard had stolen was gone forever, spent or hidden or transferred in ways that couldn't be traced. But I still had enough to live comfortably, enough to never worry about basic needs again, enough to make a difference in the world if I chose to use it wisely. And I did choose to use it wisely. I established a foundation focused on helping people who'd fallen through the cracks the way I had, providing emergency assistance to prevent homelessness, funding legal aid for people fighting conservatorships and other forms of financial abuse, supporting organizations that work directly with homeless populations. I finished my graduate degree, writing my thesis about the experience of homelessness and the systemic failures that perpetuated it, using my own story as a case study while being careful to protect my privacy and not turn my trauma into a spectacle. And eventually I went to work for a nonprofit that advocated for policy changes to prevent the kind of financial abuse I'd experienced, working to close loopholes in conservatorship laws, pushing for better oversight of trusts and estates, fighting for stronger protections for vulnerable adults who might be targeted by family members or others seeking to exploit them financially. The work was meaningful, satisfying in ways that simply having money and comfort never could be, because it took the worst experience of my life and transformed it into something that could help others, that could prevent other people from going through what I'd endured. And through it all, I carried with me the memory of that day in the law firm lobby, the feeling of being judged and dismissed and treated as less than human because of how I looked, because of circumstances beyond my control. I carried it not as a burden, but as a reminder, a touchstone to keep me grounded, to make sure I never forgot what it felt like to be on the other side, to be the person everyone looked past, instead of the person everyone saw. Because here's what I learned from all of this. What I want you to understand if you take nothing else away from my story. Appearances mean nothing. The person you dismiss today because they're wearing ragged clothes and smell bad and don't fit your idea of what success looks like might be fighting battles you can't imagine, might have a story that would break your heart if you took the time to hear it, might be someone who deserves kindness and dignity regardless of their circumstances. We live in a world that judges quickly and harshly, that sorts people into categories of worthy and unworthy, based on superficial characteristics, that forgets that every single person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And I'm here to tell you that we can do better than that. We have to do better than that. Because the way we treat the most vulnerable members of our society, the way we respond to people who are struggling and suffering and in need of help, says everything about who we are as a culture, as a civilization, as human beings. So the next time you see someone who looks like they're down on their luck, someone who's dirty or disheveled or asking for help, I want you to remember my story. I want you to think about the fact that person might have a name that means something, might have a history that would surprise you, might be someone's son or daughter or parent or friend, someone who matters, someone who deserves to be treated with basic human decency, regardless of their current circumstances. And if you can, if you have the resources and the opportunity, help them. Not because they've proven they deserve it, not because you verified their story or confirmed they're worthy of your assistance, but simply because they're a human being, and they need help, and you have the ability to provide it. That's what I've dedicated my life to now, helping people who are where I was, breaking down the barriers that keep people trapped in cycles of poverty and homelessness, working to create a world where what happened to me can't happen to others, where people don't fall through the cracks and disappear while everyone else just walks on by. It's been 5 years since that day I walked into Sterling & Associates looking like a homeless person, and walked out with my life on the path to being restored. 5 years of therapy and healing and growth and learning who I am now, who I've become through all of this. And I can honestly say that while I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone, while I'd give anything to have my father back and to not have lost those 8 months to the streets, I also recognize that it changed me in ways that might ultimately have been positive. It gave me empathy I didn't have before. It gave me perspective I couldn't have gained any other way. It gave me a purpose and a mission that makes my life feel meaningful in ways it never did, when I was just coasting along as a privileged kid with a trust fund and a comfortable future. So to everyone watching this video, everyone who's taken the time to listen to my story, I want to say thank you. Thank you for caring, for paying attention, for considering what I've been through and what I've learned. And I want to ask you to do something for me, for yourself, for the world we all share. I want you to look at people differently from now on. Really look at them. See them as full human beings with complex stories and difficult circumstances. Don't judge based on appearances. Don't assume you know someone's worth by how they're dressed or where they're living or what their current circumstances are. Treat everyone with dignity and respect, because you never know what battles they're fighting, what losses they've endured, what strength it's taking them just to get through the day. Have you ever experienced something that completely changed your perspective on life, that made you see the world differently? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Share your experiences, your insights, your own journeys through difficult times. Let's build a community of people who understand that we're all just humans, trying to make it through this complicated, challenging, sometimes beautiful world together. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel something, please leave a like on this video. It helps the algorithm show this story to more people, helps spread this message of compassion and dignity and the importance of not judging others based on appearances. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories like this one. Stories about real people facing real challenges. Stories that might change how you see the world and your place in it. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos, because I have so many more stories to share, so many more experiences to talk about, so many more lessons I've learned that might help you navigate your own difficult moments. Remember, we're all just walking each other home, as they say. We're all in this together, struggling and surviving and hopefully, occasionally thriving. So let's treat each other with kindness, with grace, with the understanding that life is hard for everyone in different ways, and that a little compassion can make all the difference between someone giving up and someone finding the strength to keep going. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here. And thank you for hopefully taking these lessons out into the world with you and treating others with the dignity and respect that every human being deserves, regardless of how they look or what their circumstances are. Because that ragged person you see on the street, that person everyone's dismissing and ignoring, might just have a story as powerful and surprising as mine. They might just be fighting the hardest battle of their lives. And your kindness, your acknowledgement of their humanity, might be exactly what they need to keep going for one more day.